Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Wade Henderson. I'm president of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, a coalition of more than 200 national civil and human rights groups working to build an America that's as good as its ideals. I'm also honored to be the Joseph L. Rao, Jr. Professor of Public Interest Law at the Law School at the University of the District of Columbia. It's my pleasure to open this briefing today to discuss the Universal Periodic Review process and its role in advancing human rights here at home. The process, known as the UPR, was instituted with the creation of the UN Human Rights Council and requires every member of the Council to prepare a comprehensive report on human rights in their own countries, as well as their compliance with international human rights treaties that they've ratified. The U.S. became a member of the Human Rights Council in 2009, and this was the first time that the U.S. had submitted a UPR report to the Council. Now, I want to thank, of course, Senator Durbin for what he has done, and I really want to thank Joe Zogby for helping to arrange this. And Joe's a great guy, and Durbin's a great guy as well. But I do think it's important to note that the Leadership Conference, really firmly believes that civil and human rights must be measured by a single yardstick. And while we have always considered civil and human rights to be intrinsically linked, for most of our history, we framed our work primarily around civil rights. Last year, as we approached our 60th anniversary, we determined that the time had come to make the connection between civil and human rights more explicit, which is why we formally incorporated the term human rights into our name. Now, this change honors the legacy and foresight of our founders and ties our work more explicitly to international human rights norms and standards adopted around the world. In addition, it helps us to cement the connection between civil rights and human rights in the minds of everyone with whom we work and communicate. We're reminded that the NAACP, one of the founding organizations of the Leadership Conference, was active in the founding of the United Nations in the effort to gain adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The NAACP was also among the first to raise issues of domestic race discrimination before the UN Human Rights Commission. So this history of linking civil and human rights has a long antecedent. So today, that struggle to bring the U.S. into greater compliance with its human rights commitments and treaty obligations continues unabated. And non-governmental organizations, including those from the civil rights community, are working with many others to hold the U.S. accountable to implement these commitments. A human rights approach can help us address persistent discrimination and spur action in response to pervasive poverty, ill health, and inadequate education that disproportionately affect communities of color. Now, through the Human Rights at Home campaign, a coalition of more than 50 human and civil rights and social justice organizations that includes the Leadership Conference, we're working to establish the kind of infrastructure and processes needed to more effectively implement and monitor human rights right here at home. This past November, the United States, of course a member of the Council, submitted its first ever report, and to the credit of the Obama administration, the U.S. government actively sought out the views of NGOs. As you will hear in more detail, before the report was submitted, the State Department held meetings around the country to hear directly from citizens, activists, and academics about their views on human rights implementation in the United States, including one here in Washington convened by the Leadership Conference and by the American Civil Liberties Union jointly. Now, following the presentation of its report to the Human Rights Council in Geneva, the U.S. convened a first-of-its-kind town hall meeting where NGOs engaged in a dialogue directly with U.S. government representatives. In its report, the U.S. acknowledged critical advances in civil and human rights, but it also reiterated its commitment to an agenda of unfinished business. At the Leadership Conference, we were pleased that the report highlighted 3 of our key legislative achievements: the passage of the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, the passage of the Matthew Shepard, James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act, and the passage of the Fair Sentencing Act, which you just heard about. But we also recognize that further progress is urgently needed. In many areas, such as immigration reform, racial profiling, housing for the homeless, LGBT rights, and treaty ratification, particularly the treaties of CEDAW that we mentioned earlier, the rights of women and the rights of persons with disabilities, we need to do a lot more work as a nation before we can feel comfortable about where we stand on human rights. Now, we also believe that the seriousness with which the U.S. government prepared the UPR report and the extensive consultation process are noteworthy, and we want to acknowledge that. But process alone is not a substitute for genuine progress in incorporating important standards into the policy work that we do. So while we salute the process, there is a lot more to be done. And our distinguished panel today is going to talk about that in great detail. Now, I'm privileged really to moderate this panel and to introduce actually 4. 3 are here now, and 1 will be joining us shortly, of the most distinguished advocates in the nation, often practicing their trade here in Washington to do the great work that helps us collectively advance the goals we share on civil and human rights. First, we'll hear from Ajamu Baraka, Executive Director of a coalition of over 300 U.S.-based organizations known as the U.S. Human Rights Network. Ajamu is well known to advocates, he's well known to policymakers in Washington and in New York, and internationally. And Ajamu has actually participated in the UPR process from the inception, including, if I'm not mistaken, going back to Geneva in March for the issuance of the U.S. report. So Ajamu is really a voice that we'll welcome to the podium momentarily. Next, we'll hear from Maria Vascarinas, founder and executive director of the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty, a national organization whose mission is to prevent and to end homelessness. If you were an advocate in Washington working on housing issues, or in any way had concern about the treatment of homelessness, which has been a persistent problem now for over 2 decades, you'd be familiar with the work of Maria. She is really one of the most well-respected voices in town on these important issues that get far too little treatment, adequate treatment in the policy circles in which we travel. So we're delighted, Maria, to have you here today. Our third speaker will be Christina Finch. And by no means is Christina, even though I'm introducing her third, unknown to this process. Christina is the Government Relations Director for Amnesty International USA. Amnesty is, I think, probably without dispute, the most well-known human rights organization today. Celebrated recently its 50th anniversary, and I was privileged to be in San Francisco when they had that celebration. A remarkable meeting, because among the young people who turned out in droves, it was fascinating to see how Amnesty really inspires young people globally to take human rights seriously and to take it back to colleges and to high schools. It was a remarkable program. And then our last speaker, who is actually in transit, is a dear friend and advocate working on issues day and night. Her name is Laura Murphy. She is the longtime director of the American Civil Liberties Union, Washington National Office. There's a great deal one could say about Laura's advocacy and her work on a variety of important civil and human rights issues. Her organization, though, is one of the most well-respected in the country, and Laura is a fierce advocate